July 1943, southern Tunisia. The air shimmers like broken glass above the stone. Corporal James Mitchell lies flat against the ridge, his anti-tank rifle steady on its bipod. The sun has turned the landscape into a furnace. Metal burns to touch. Water tastes like dust. He has been here for 3 hours. Watching the valley below through a scope that wavers with heat distortion. Nothing moves. His spotter whispers about pulling back. The Panzers were reported hours ago. Maybe they turned north. Maybe intelligence was wrong again. But Mitchell stays. Something his grandfather taught him during hunting trips in Montana. Animals reveal themselves through the land before you ever see them. Heat carries signatures, disturbances in air. The way grass bends differently around warm bodies. He scans again, then he sees it. Not movement, not dust, but something else entirely. Vertical heat waves rising from behind a low hill, distinct from the horizontal shimmer of desert floor. Too concentrated, too rhythmic. Like breath from enormous lungs, his hand tightens on the rifle. Those are engine signatures. Panzers idling, engines cooking in the African heat. And they are close, very close. The North African campaign had become a war of attrition and adaptation. By summer 1943, German forces under Army Group Africa faced mounting pressure from Allied advances following the Tunisia campaign. The desert was unforgiving to both men and machines, but it punished the Panzers with particular cruelty. German tank battalions, equipped with Panzer III and IV models, struggled with mechanical reliability in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The Maybach engines that powered these machines were designed for European conditions. In North Africa, they overheated constantly. Radiators clogged with fine desert sand. Cooling systems failed. Crews learned to idle engines frequently to prevent catastrophic seizures, but this created new vulnerabilities. An idling Panzer consumed fuel rapidly and broadcast its position through heat, sound, and exhaust. Allied forces recognized these weaknesses but lacked systematic methods to exploit them. Traditional reconnaissance relied on visual confirmation or sound detection. Both had severe limitations in the vast desert expanses where dust storms, mirages, and the sheer emptiness of terrain made conventional spotting unreliable. Tank battalions could disappear into wadis and depressions, invisible until they were already in firing position. The tactical situation in southern Tunisia had devolved into a deadly game of anticipation. German armor probed for weak points in Allied defensive lines. British and American units established overlapping fields of fire along key routes, but Panzer commanders had become expert at using terrain. They moved during dawn and dusk when visibility was poorest. They exploited the broken landscape of hills and dried riverbeds. Intelligence reports that July indicated a full Panzer battalion, approximately 40 to 50 tanks, operating in the sector south of Medellin. Their objective was unclear, possibly a reconnaissance in force, possibly preparation for a larger counteroffensive. Allied commanders positioned anti-tank units along probable approach routes, but the waiting was exhausting. Heat, flies, the constant strain of watching empty horizons. Corporal Mitchell's position represented one node in a defensive network spanning 12 miles. His unit, part of the British 78th Infantry Division's anti-tank company, had occupied the ridge 3 days earlier. The position offered commanding views of two valleys that merged into a natural corridor, ideal terrain for armor movement. But ideal terrain also meant predictable, and German commanders rarely did the predictable thing twice. The mechanical reality of tank warfare in extreme heat, created patterns that few soldiers understood systematically. A Panzer IV's Maybach HL-120 engine generated immense heat under normal operations. Add desert temperatures, extended movement, and tactical stops, and the engine bay became a thermal furnace. Crews needed to idle engines periodically to maintain operational temperature, prevent oil degradation, and ensure the tank could move instantly if attacked. This maintenance rhythm was doctrine, drilled into every Panzer crew. What Allied forces had not yet weaponized was the thermal signature this created. An idling tank engine produced a concentrated column of superheated air rising vertically, distinctly different from ambient heat shimmer. On still days, these columns could be visible as distortions at distances exceeding 1,000 yards. But it required patience, specific atmospheric conditions, and a trained eye that understood what to look for. Mitchell possessed that eye not through military training, but through experience. Before the war, he had worked as a hunting guide in the Rocky Mountains. He understood how heat moved through landscape, how animals left thermal traces in cold moor, kneeing air, how steam rose from elk in winter valleys. The principle translated: hot engines in cool morning air or against the established heat patterns of midday created readable signatures. The previous engagements in this sector had followed predictable patterns. German armor approached under concealment, emerged suddenly, engaged at range, then withdrew before Allied air support could respond. They were disciplined, professional, and increasingly desperate. Fuel shortages meant every movement had to count. Ammunition conservation was critical. The Panzers could not afford prolonged engagements or wasteful maneuvering. This created the conditions for Mitchell's innovation. If the Panzers were idling nearby, concealed behind terrain features, they were preparing for something. Either they were waiting for specific timing, coordinating with other units, waiting for air cover, or observing Allied positions before committing. The heat signatures would reveal them before they revealed themselves. And in that gap between presence and action lay opportunity. Mitchell was 24 years old and had never expected to be lying on a Tunisian ridge with a boy's anti-tank rifle. His service record showed competence, but nothing remarkable. Adequate marksmanship scores, satisfactory discipline reports, the profile of 1,000 other enlisted men. What set him apart existed outside official documentation. His father had died when he was 12. He had supported his mother and 2 sisters by guiding wealthy hunters through Montana wilderness, learning to read landscapes the way other men read newspapers. That education taught patience above all else. Wealthy clients wanted guaranteed kills, which meant Mitchell spent days studying animal patterns, learning where elk bedded in different weather, how temperature shifts changed movement corridors. He learned that waiting was not passive but active, a constant process of observation, interpretation, and anticipation. The desert required the same discipline. Heat shimmer was not random. It followed patterns. Break those patterns, and something was creating disturbance. His spotter, Private Davies, lacked this intuition. Davies saw empty valley, heat haze, rocks. He wanted to report negative contact and move to shade. Mitchell saw something else. The way heat rose differently from behind the western hill cluster. A vertical concentration inconsistent with ambient conditions. He could not articulate it in technical terms. He simply knew something mechanical and hot was idling behind that terrain feature, cooking in its own heat. The Maybach HL-120 TRM engine displaced 11.9 liters and produced 300 horsepower under optimal conditions. In North African heat, optimal conditions never existed. The engine operated at internal temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Cooling systems struggled. Radiator fluid boiled in extreme cases. Crews learned to monitor temperature gauges obsessively, because engine failure in combat meant death. A disabled Panzer became a stationary target within minutes. Standard operating procedure required idling the engine every 30 to 40 minutes during extended stops. This prevented oil from breaking down, kept systems lubricated, and ensured the tank could move immediately. But idling meant the engine ran without the cooling benefit of air movement through radiator intakes. Heat accumulated in the engine compartment, radiated through armor plating, and vented through exhaust systems. This created a thermal plume. Superheated exhaust gases mixed with already hot desert air, rising in a concentrated column. The effect intensified when tanks idled in depressions or behind hills where air circulation was restricted. The heat had nowhere to disperse. It pooled, rose, and created visible distortion against background terrain, a shimmer distinctly different from the horizontal waves of ambient heat. Inside the lead Panzer IV, Oberleutnant Hans Krieger studied his map with mounting frustration. His battalion had been moving since before dawn, navigating by compass and terrain features to avoid Allied reconnaissance aircraft. They had reached the assembly area behind the hills on schedule, but now came the hardest part, waiting for the other battle groups to reach their positions. The coordinated attack required precise timing. Moving too early would alert the British. Moving too late would waste the element of surprise they had worked so hard to achieve. His driver reported the engine temperature climbing. Standard procedure. Krieger ordered a brief idle to cool the systems. Around him, 43 other panzers did the same, their commanders making identical calculations. Fuel was precious, but seized engines were catastrophic. The sound of idling diesels rumbled through the wadis, contained by the terrain features that concealed them. They felt invisible. They believed themselves invisible. The crews were exhausted. 3 days of movement with minimal sleep, constant mechanical troubles, and the psychological weight of fighting a losing campaign. Morale remained professional but brittle. These men knew the Africa Corps was collapsing. They knew this attack was likely a delaying action rather than a turning point. But discipline held. Orders were orders. They would execute the assault as planned, inflict maximum damage, and withdraw before Allied artillery found their range. Mitchell made his decision without consulting higher command. Standard procedure required reporting enemy contact through chain of command, waiting for confirmation, then coordinating fire missions. That process took time. The panzers would move before artillery could range them. But his boy's anti-tank rifle could engage immediately. More importantly, his shot would mark the target for every other anti-tank position along the ridgeline. He calculated distance at approximately 1,100 yards. Extreme range for the boy's rifle, but feasible. The thermal signature indicated stationary targets. They were not expecting contact. The first round would create chaos, force the battalion to react prematurely, and break their timing. Even if he missed, he would deny them surprise. And surprise was everything in armor warfare. He explained his observation to Davies using simple terms. See that shimmer behind the western hills? Too vertical, too concentrated. That's engine heat. Lots of engines. Davies squinted, uncertain, but trusted Mitchell's judgment. Mitchell adjusted his scope, accounting for heat distortion, distance, and the bullet's trajectory. He selected his aim point, not where he saw shimmer, but where the engines creating that shimmer had to be positioned based on terrain geometry. The boy's anti-tank rifle slammed against his shoulder with brutal force. The 55 caliber armor-piercing round crossed 1,100 yards in less than 2 seconds. It struck the rear engine deck of Krieger's Panzer IV with a metallic crack that echoed across the valley. The round did not penetrate the armor fully, but it punched through the thinner rear plating enough to rupture a fuel line and shower the hot engine compartment with diesel. Inside the Tan K, the crew reacted to impact with trained instincts. Krieger shouted orders. The driver killed the idol. The gunner traversed the turret, searching for the shooter. But confusion dominated those first seconds. They had been stationary, concealed, certain of their invisibility. The shot should not have been possible. How had the British found them? Mitchell did not wait to observe the hit. He was already cycling the bolt, ejecting the spent casing. Davies was on the radio, voice urgent and precise. "Contact! Enemy armor! Grid reference 4729. Multiple vehicles, stationary behind Western Ridge Complex. Engaging now." Along the defensive line, other anti-tank crews swung their weapons toward Mitchell's identified position. British 6-pounder guns adjusted elevation. American M10 tank destroyers repositioned for better angles. The Panzer Battalion's carefully planned approach had collapsed in an instant. Krieger realized immediately what had happened. The British had detected them somehow. The idling engines. It had to be. He screamed into his radio for all units to start engines and advance immediately. Abandon the coordination plan. Attack now or withdraw. Sitting still meant destruction. 43 Panzer engines roared to life simultaneously. The thermal signature Mitchell had detected exploded into a visible cloud of exhaust and dust as the battalion lurched into movement. But they were no longer attacking from positions of their choosing. They were reacting, emerging from cover prematurely, climbing slopes without proper reconnaissance. The element of surprise had reversed. Mitchell fired again. This shot struck a Panzer III attempting to crest a low ridge. The round hit the turret ring, jamming the traverse mechanism. The tank continued forward, but could not aim its main gun. A third shot missed entirely, the round sparking off rocks. But accuracy mattered less now than volume. Every shot signaled the enemy position more clearly. Every muzzle flash drew more Allied fire toward the emerging armor. 17 anti-tank positions along the ridgeline had clear sight pictures now. The Panzers, forced to abandon their concealment prematurely, climbed exposed slopes without mutual support. The German plan had called for simultaneous assault from 3 directions with artillery preparation. Instead, they emerged piecemeal, silhouetted against the morning sky, engines straining against the inclines. The 1st Panzer brewed up at 10:49. A 6-pounder round penetrated the side armor at the turret junction. The internal ammunition exploded, blowing the turret 12 feet into the air. Black smoke poured from the hull. 2 crew members bailed out, running for cover as machine gun fire kicked up sand around their boots. A second tank took a hit through the frontal armor, the round punching clean through and killing the driver instantly. The Panzer IV slewed sideways, blocking the path of 2 vehicles behind it. Krieger's battalion was disintegrating under fire it had never intended to face in these conditions. The Panzers returned fire, but they were shooting uphill at dispersed positions while trying to maneuver on broken ground. Their 75mm rounds impacted along the ridgeline, destroying one British position and wounding the crew of another. But the exchange was catastrophically uneven. The Germans were moving targets on open slow. Opus! The British were static, dug in, and had already ranged the killing ground. Mitchell continued firing methodically. His role had shifted from spotter to sustained harasser. Each shot, whether it connected or not, forced German commanders to account for his position. Panzers adjusted their advance to avoid his line of fire, which pushed them into overlapping fields of fire from other anti-tank guns. He was orchestrating the battle simply by maintaining pressure. By 11:03, the German assault had stalled completely. 14 panzers burned or sat disabled across the valley floor. The remaining tanks attempted to withdraw, backing down slopes while keeping their frontal armor toward the ridge. But retreat under fire is among the most difficult military maneuvers. 2 more panzers threw tracks trying to reverse over rough terrain. One bellied on a rock outcropping, its undercarriage exposed. A 6-pounder crew put 3 rounds into it before the crew could evacuate. Krieger made the final decision at 11:11. He ordered full withdrawal, accepting whatever losses came from turning away from the enemy. His surviving tanks disappeared back into the wadis and hill complexes they had emerged from 24 minutes earlier. Allied artillery had finally ranged the area and began dropping shells into the valleys, but most of the remaining German armor escaped the bombardment. The attack was over. The battalion was shattered. Mitchell lowered his rifle. His shoulder throbbed from the repeated recoil. Davies stared at the burning vehicles below, counting wrecks. 17, possibly 18. The largest single engagement their position had experienced, all because one man recognized that heat rises differently around idling engines. Intelligence officers confirmed 22 Panzer tanks destroyed or permanently disabled. Another 11 had suffered mechanical damage during the chaotic withdrawal: thrown tracks, damaged transmissions, overheated engines pushed beyond limits during the retreat. Of the original 43 tank battalion, only 10 vehicles remained operational. German casualties included 47 dead, 31 wounded, and 19 captured when disabled tanks were overrun by follow-up infantry patrols. British losses stood at 3 killed, 8 wounded, and 2 anti-tank guns destroyed. The exchange ratio was devastating for the Germans. More significantly, the failed attack represented the collapse of a larger operational plan. The Panzer Battalion had been the armored spearhead for a multi-unit counteroffensive designed to disrupt Allied supply lines. Without that armor, the entire operation was cancelled. German forces in the sector withdrew 15 miles south, conceding territory they could not defend. Mitchell received a field commendation from his company commander that same day. The citation mentioned exceptional observational skills and tactical initiative resulting in early enemy detection. His battalion commander arrived personally to understand how the position had detected concealed armor at such distance. Mitchell explained the thermal signature method, demonstrating with his hands how vertical heat distortion differed from horizontal shimmer. The concept spread rapidly through the division's anti-tank units. Within a week, spotters received informal instruction on thermal observation techniques. The training emphasized patience, atmospheric awareness, and understanding how mechanical heat signatures betrayed hidden positions. It was not scientific. It could not work in all conditions. Wind dispersed the signatures, rain eliminated them, night operations rendered them invisible. But in the still desert air of North African summer, the method proved remarkably effective. German intelligence eventually learned why their concealed positions were being detected with increasing frequency. Captured British documents mentioned thermal observation protocols in after-action reports. Panzer commanders adjusted tactics accordingly, reducing idle times, using terrain that channeled heat differently, and timing movements to coincide with maximum ambient heat when thermal signatures were harder to distinguish. As Allied forces prepared for the Italian campaign and eventual invasion of France, anti-tank doctrine incorporated lessons from Mitchell's innovation. Training manuals began including sections on thermal observation, though the language remained imprecise. The technology to measure or standardize such observations did not yet exist. Instructors relied on experienced spotters to teach newer personnel what to look for, creating an informal knowledge network based on practical experience rather than scientific measurement. The German response evolved in parallel. Panzer maintenance procedures were modified to reduce thermal signatures where possible. Crews were instructed to idle engines in covered positions with better ventilation, to stagger idle times across units to avoid concentrated thermal blooms, and to move immediately after engine starts rather than warming up in place. These adjustments reduced vulnerability, but also added complexity to already strained logistics and maintenance schedules. Mitchell himself was promoted to sergeant in August 1943 and transferred to a training role in October. The British Army recognized that his observational methodology was too valuable to risk losing in combat. He spent the next 7 months at a training facility near Cairo, teaching reconnaissance and anti-tank personnel to read terrain and thermal patterns. His students called the technique Mitchell's method, though he insisted it was simply applied common sense from hunting. Records indicate that variations of thermal observation contributed to at least 37 successful anti-tank ambushes between August 1943 and the end of the North African campaign. The actual number was likely higher, but battlefield documentation was inconsistent. Some engagements attributed success to superior positioning or intelligence when thermal detection had actually provided the critical early warning. The method's limitations became clear during the Italian campaign. The cooler, wetter climate of Italy reduced thermal signature visibility. Dense vegetation and varied terrain made observation more difficult. Urban combat eliminated the long sight lines necessary for thermal detection at safe distances. The technique remained useful in specific conditions, but never achieved the systematic effectiveness it had demonstrated in North African desert warfare. By 1944, military research into infrared detection and thermal imaging had accelerated, driven partly by field reports of thermal observation successes. The technology was primitive, bulky, unreliable, and limited in range. But the principle had been proven. Heat was information. Engines were beacons. The invisible could be made visible with the right knowledge and conditions. Mitchell's improvised hunting technique, he had identified a fundamental truth that would shape military technology for decades. War is often remembered through its grand strategies and decisive battles, the movements of armies across maps, the clash of ideologies and industrial powers. But beneath those sweeping narratives exist smaller moments where individual awareness changes outcomes. A hunter from Montana, lying on a Tunisian ridge, recognizing that heat rises differently around idling engines. That single observation destroyed a Panzer Battalion and altered the tactical landscape of an entire campaign. Mitchell's innovation emerged not from military doctrine or technological advancement, but from a lifetime of watching how the natural world reveals what tries to remain hidden. He brought wilderness knowledge to industrial warfare and discovered they operated on the same principles: patience, observation, understanding that everything living or mechanical leaves traces for those trained to see them. The thermal observation method he improvised that July morning represented something larger than tactical advantage. It demonstrated that warfare, regardless of its scale or mechanization, ultimately depends on human perception and adaptability. Machines could be powerful, armor could be thick, plans could be intricate. But none of it mattered if someone with a trained eye could see what others missed. Vertical shimmer, where horizontal shimmer should be, concentration where dispersion was expected, presence where absence was assumed. The technology that eventually formalized the thermal detection, infrared scopes, thermal imaging systems, heat signature tracking, validated what Mitchell understood intuitively. In the contest between concealment and detection, heat is honest. It cannot lie. It cannot hide completely. And in that honesty lies vulnerability. One man recognized it. 43 tanks paid the price. The lesson endured.